Andrew, you've just published a book on Christian-Muslim relations in Syria. What's the full title of the book?
Right, the full title is Christian-Muslim Relations in Syria, Historic and Contemporary Dynamics in a Changing Context.
Why did you undertake the study?
It goes back a long way. I mean, it's a long history, but it's basically for three main reasons. Firstly, because of a deep and long-standing awareness of the ancient Christian presence in the Middle East and a fascination with that presence. And not just the presence of the Christian presence in the Middle East, but its diversity, its huge breadth. Alongside that, the encounter and the historic encounter and historic coexistence, for the most part, with Islam. So it's the place where Islam emerged and the place of birth of Christianity. So Christianity has coexisted alongside Islam for centuries. And thirdly, because throughout the region, but especially in Syria and through several visits to Syria before the war, I noticed particularly the example of the faith communities, especially during the war, in both sustaining of their faith and in maintaining that relationship with their brothers and sisters of other faiths as well, of the Muslim faith as well. So a real fascination with those three particular elements, Christian presence and diversity, Muslim interaction, and the example of the faith communities in that region since their birth.
And I understand that the book arose out of some doctoral research that you were undertaking for a number of years. How did you undertake the research?
Yes, I mean, I suppose I did a master's in Abrahamic religions, so sort of in-depth study of the interaction between Christianity and Islam and Judaism. And then this emerged from several visits to Syria, both before the war and then during the war, and I can talk a bit more about that. So it involved study of academic sources, obviously, both of the Christian history in that region, particularly in Syria, of which there's very little. This is actually quite a unique book, because it's the first one that deals with the interaction between Christian-Muslim relations in Syria particularly. Obviously study of Islam, but also a lot of in-depth ethnographic research on the ground in Syria during 10 visits to Syria between 2014 and 18, widespread travels across Syria in the midst of the war. Engaging with Christian communities and Muslim communities, all Syrians, at the forefront of in some of the areas most affected by the conflict. A very profound experience that was.
So how is the book structured?
So it's actually quite a simple structure in one sense. It's in 5 main chapters. The first chapter deals with the historic and contemporary Christian landscape. So the breadth of the Christian landscape in Syria particularly, and in the wider context of the Middle East. The second chapter, I go into the look at the Muslim mosaic, because the Islam within Syria is actually as broad as Christianity in Syria. So you have this incredible mosaic of Christian and Muslim expression in Syria. And the second chapter deals with that breadth of Muslim expression, Islamic expression in Syria. Then in the third chapter, I study some of the cultural issues related to Christian-Muslim relations in Syria, particularly issues of religious leadership, both Christian religious leadership and Muslim religious leadership, and the cultural expression of religious leadership in society. But also a section on sectarianism and the development of sectarianism in the region. And then the fourth chapter, I go in an in-depth study of the Christian-Muslim dynamics during the course of the war, with case studies, actual narratives of how faith communities have interrelated during the course of the war, both in urban contexts and in rural contexts. And in areas where the conflict has been most effective. And then finally, the fifth chapter is actually a very significant chapter, and it's fairly unique, because what I seek to do is to look at Eastern Christian approaches, particularly to Christian-Muslim relations in Syria. And I take several key Eastern Christian theologians, all contemporary. Bishop George Qadr, who is Lebanese, Patriarch Ignatius of Frem, who's a Syriac Orthodox patriarch, who's actually written the foreword for the book, which I'm very privileged to have had him write the foreword. Melkite Archbishop John Barr from Aleppo, Father Paolo Dell'Aglio, the Jesuit priest who lived in Marmousa for several years and has disappeared, and Chaldean Bishop Aldo from Aleppo. And I reflect on their contributions, their contemporary contributions to Christian-Muslim dialogue and thinking. And then I do also a section on Protestantism and the Protestant dynamic within the Eastern Christian perspective.
Which is a comparatively late
which is
development.
comparatively late and has its complexities. And there is quite a significant section in the book on the complex dynamic of Protestant Christian, Middle Eastern Protestant Christian dynamic within the Middle East and the relationships with the Eastern churches as well. And then, of course, a conclusion that follows.
And that Protestant element is largely a result of Western missionaries as opposed to the indigenous church.
Indeed. Of course, the Protestants, and most of the Protestants in the region, are indigenous. So they are Arab, they are Palestinian or Jordanian or Lebanese or Syrian. But yes, they are of Western tradition. And this is one of the dynamics, one of the dilemmas that the Protestant churches face. And that is an issue that I deal with quite in depth in the book, in that chapter on Eastern Christian dynamics.
And what were your main conclusions arising out of this research?
Several, really. Firstly, one which seems quite obvious, but is not necessarily obvious to most readers and to most people in the West, is the fact that the religious landscape in Syria, actually a lot of people wouldn't have a clue that the religious landscape in Syria, both Christian and Muslim, is plural and diverse. An incredible plurality and diversity in the religious landscape. And that's widely unrecognised and understudied, which is why I wanted to study it. Secondly, the whole issue of sectarianism and the rise of sectarianism. There's a big question mark over whether this is a sectarian conflict. And there are many Syrians who will say, no, it's not a sectarian conflict, it's political and so forth. And I look at the whole issue of how most Syrians want to preserve the plurality of Syrian society and examine the idea that sectarianism as we think of it in a way is a Western construct and a construct of the nations in the early 20th century, 19th century. So there's that study to that. And then the third main conclusion or conclusions that come out of it are looking at this is the importance of some scholars, and I've taken the title, the Antiochian paradigm of Eastern Christianity, the importance of Eastern Christianity and Eastern Christian theology to Muslim-Christian dialogue and relationship.
Because they've been living in harmony with each other for hundreds of years.
Exactly. And Qadr is very strong on this. He says we are much more able to engage with Islam because we have lived with it for centuries than Western Christianity. And my study of the theology and study of the churches, actually I would go along with that. And I think that the church, the global church, has an enormous amount to learn from the Eastern churches and its historic engagement with Islam. And that's one of the purposes of the book and one of the main conclusions that I come to. How that one does that is the subject of other books. But this is actually a unique book. There is no other book actually that deals with this subject. And particularly it's unique in that it's the only academic research to be undertaken in Syria during the course of the conflict and looking at the religious dynamics as opposed to political ones.
Thank you, Andrew, for sharing about your new book coming out, Christian-Muslim Relations in Syria. If folk want to get hold of a copy, how do they do that?
Yes, unfortunately, Routledge is very, very expensive. It's an academic publisher, and the book is not intended just for academic readership. It is very readable. It's written to be read by anybody. It's available through Routledge. It's also available on Amazon. There's a little discount on Amazon. It's up there already for pre-order, and other bookshop websites. It's on Waterstones and so forth. It's in hardback, coming out in hardback initially, at a very expensive price, and it's going to be marketed to universities globally and institutions globally, and then hopefully in about 18 months it'll come out in softback and be much more affordable. But yes, it's online. It's available in hardback very shortly.
Thank you, Andrew.
Thank you.